Alrighty, so we're going to take a look at some air brake systems. We're going to do a simple review on how the system works, and we're going to start off with a look at a schematic diagram of the air brake system. This diagram here, we're going to focus on the first part of the air brake system, kind of the first thing in line, that being the compressor. So the compressor on your air brake system, it's typically engine driven, maybe through the timing gear case or belt driven. Nowadays, probably not so much belt driven. The compressor is going to be discharging air through to the air dryer. The job of the air dryer is to get the moisture out of the air as much as possible. It's not going to get 100% of the moisture out of the air, but it's going to get most of it out. After the air is dried, it's going to head off to one of the three reservoirs. And when I say three reservoirs, there may be more than three reservoirs on a truck, but there's obviously going to have to be a supply reservoir and then a primary and secondary. A very common name for the supply reservoir, your wet tank. Okay, lots of people know it as a wet tank, but that is the first one in line after the compressor. Now, something that's not shown on this diagram here is what might be located between the air dryer and the supply reservoir. In cold climates, any moisture in the system has a potential to start freezing up in the air brake system. That's a recipe for disaster. So we try and get as much moisture out as possible, but if we can't get it all out, what might we do?
Some alcohol?
We're going to have an alcohol injector there. So we're going to put air brake antifreeze, which is literally just methanol and maybe some rubber conditioner mixed together. And it's an alcohol evaporator that just siphons a little bit of alcohol vapor from the tank, the alcohol reservoir, and allows it to mix with the air and the moisture that happens to be in the supply reservoir. And that keeps that moisture from freezing up and lets it vent it out the spit valve on the bottom. Okay. Now, if we focus just on this section still, you'll notice that yes, we have the air dryer, yes, we have the compressor and the supply reservoir, but we also have the governor. The job of the governor is to control the system pressure. Okay. So the governor on the compressor turns the compressor on and off, and it doesn't stop the compressor from rotating because the compressor is permanently affixed to the engine, whether it be through the timing gears or through belt drive right off of the accessory drive pulley. It's always turning. So if the compressor is always turning, that means the pistons are always pumping up and down. And if the pistons are always pumping up and down, how do we stop this thing from pumping air? Well, the governor is going to monitor the air pressure in the supply reservoir, and the pressure signal from the supply reservoir acting on the governor is going to cause the governor to operate a little valve inside of itself. And it's going to send air into the compressor, to a certain spot in the compressor, to stop it from pumping. Well, what exactly is that? It's called the unloader valve, or the unloading pistons, more specifically. The unloading pistons, what they do is they actually physically hold the intake valves inside the compressor open. If I've got two pistons pumping back and forth inside the compressor, and both of them have their intake valves held open, that means that we're just going to be circulating the air back and forth between the pistons. Okay. So when the governor is in the unload position, it pressurizes the unloading pistons, which hold open the intake valves of the compressor, and then there's no more airflow coming out of the compressor and heading off to the air dryer. That's how we shut the compressor off. The governor has another job too. Does anybody know what that is? There's typically another line coming off the governor. And if you look on my diagram here, you can see it heads over to the air dryer. Does anybody know what that would be doing?
Not to blow air through there to blow all the moisture out of the air dryer.
Okay, it's the line that tells the air dryer that it's time to purge. So it might be a little bit of a misstatement to say that it's blowing it out, because it's not really blowing out the air dryer, but what it's doing is it's opening the purge valve in the air dryer, and any air that is in the air dryer still, when we shut the compressor off, is used to blow the desiccant and the separator free of, you know, moisture and oil vapor residue, things like that. Right. So as the compressor is pumping, obviously the air is going through a check valve into the supply reservoir. And as soon as the compressor shuts off, that means there is still a little bit of air pressure in that part of the system. Okay. And as soon as the governor triggers the unloading pistons to open, it also sends a pressure signal back to the air dryer to tell the air dryer purge valve to open up and blow out all the moisture, and also to blow down any moisture that might be trapped in the desiccant. All right, so moving on from there. Oh wait, we got one more thing. That safety valve. That safety valve is set to open at usually about 150 psi. The reason we have that is if the governor isn't doing what it's supposed to do and the compressor continues to pump air and it shouldn't be, instead of blowing up air tanks, we just open up a relief valve. That's what that safety valve is. It's just a relief valve. Okay, about 150 psi is when it opens. Our normal range of pressure in the system, we've got a couple of truck guys in the class here. What would you expect to see if you're watching when a compressor would cut in and when it would cut out? What's the governor's range usually?
Cutting at 90 and cut out at 120.
Okay. So 90 to about 120, 125, somewhere in that neighborhood usually, right? So that 90 to 120 or so, that's your cut in, your cut out pressures, which is still well below that 150 where that safety valve is going to pop off. Okay. All right, moving on. There's typically going to be check valves, you know, at various different places in the system, but one very important place that you're going to find check valves is right here. You can see that the primary and the secondary, they both get their air from the supply reservoir, and they get it through a check valve. And the reason that those are isolated with check valves is because if there's a problem somewhere in any of the systems, we don't want to lose all of the air in every single system. So if we got check valves and we have a problem, say in the secondary system where it vents all of its air because of a broken line or something, the primary reservoir, it's not going to be able to backfeed and dump all of its air out through the secondary, through that failed secondary. So those check valves, very important. If you wanted to see if those check valves are working properly, it's not that hard to do. Any ideas how we might do that? What if I opened up the supply reservoir, the wet tank, just blow it down, just like I was trying to drain the moisture out, but drain it all the way. Have the system charged all the way up and then drain the wet tank. If these check valves are good, my pressure should stay in my primary and secondary reservoirs. Okay? And usually if you're monitoring your air pressure gauges in the cab, you're going to have two gauges or maybe a combination gauge that monitors both tanks with two needles. All right, but you know, somehow we're going to be able to see both of those and we should see them both hold pressure. Some trucks will let you monitor your supply tank reservoir as well, some don't, but they're always going to give you a way to monitor primary and secondary pressures. Okay. So moving on from there, the air brake system from basically this point on is now two air brake systems, isn't it? There's two completely separate air brake systems on the truck. And the reason for that is safety. There's safety and redundancy. So you got your primary and your secondary. Now your primary system typically operates the rear brakes. Okay. Your secondary is typically going to be involved with operating your front brakes. You're going to have a double check valve that's effectively between the two of those that will let you still have brakes available to your trailer, even if there is a failure in one of the systems. Okay. So we're going to focus right now just on the primary. I'll talk just a little bit about what happens here. So we're going to follow the line coming from the primary over to this service relay valve. Okay. That service relay valve, and we'll talk about relay valves in a second here, but basically what the relay valve does is it acts like a pilot operated valve to send air from the reservoir directly to the service chambers in the air brakes. Okay. Your brake chambers on a modern semi-truck, a modern air brake system, they're going to have basically two sets of brakes built into them. You're going to have spring brakes, which are spring applied, air pressure released. And then you're going to have your service brakes, which are air applied. If you want to use your service brakes, that means that you have to pressurize the spring brakes. Okay. To pressurize the spring brakes, we have another relay valve. And if we take a look at where that relay valve gets its air from, let's go ahead and trace this back and see if we can figure this out. It gets its air from here. Okay. This double check valve. It's kind of interesting that we have a double check valve there, but if we think about it, it kind of makes sense. If we lost pressure in either the primary or the secondary, do you want your drives locking up on you when you're driving down the road? Or would you sooner be able to stop properly and have those spring brakes stay caged with the air so you could still use whatever brakes you have left normally? Okay. So that's why we use a double check there, so that if there is a failure in either system, the spring brakes will still stay released. Okay. Following the control side of things, if you think back to what I said earlier, I said that those relay valves are basically pilot operated valves that send air from the reservoir to whatever chamber directly. And yet when you're thinking about, hopping up in the cab of a truck, you've got a brake pedal, and typically you have a hand valve as well on the side of the steering column, maybe on the dash somewhere. Okay. Well, your brake pedal is really just sending a pilot signal to the relay valve. That Treadle valve inside the cab, if we follow this back here, is sending a pilot signal to the relay valve. Okay. Now, of course, yes, your brake pedal is going to get air pressure from the same reservoir that the service relay has. But when you push on that brake pedal, the air that's moving through that brake pedal is not the same air that's filling up those brake chambers to apply the brakes. It's just a pilot signal to turn that pilot operated relay valve on. Okay. And if we're thinking in terms of hydraulics, pilot operated hydraulics, it's easy enough to understand, right? It's the same thing here. Whenever I apply the brakes, I'm typically also sending a pressure signal to a trailer if I have a trailer connected. Because when I apply the truck brakes, I also want the trailer brakes to apply. So whether I apply the brakes with the Treadle valve or with the hand valve, you can see that I'm sending a pressure signal down the service line to the trailer. So anytime I'm applying the brakes with the Treadle valve to get my truck brakes to turn on, I'm also signaling the trailer brakes to turn on. Okay. With an air brake system, if you're not super familiar with how they work, or if you haven't driven, a truck with air brakes, I'm sure that at the very least you understand that there's a set of glad hands typically hooked up to, a set of hoses that you connect to the trailer to get the trailer to work, right? Well, those glad hands, if they're not hooked up to a trailer, there isn't air blowing out of them every single time you hit the brakes, is there? Because based on what I've told you so far, we kind of sound like every time I hit the brakes, that pressure signal going off to the service line to the trailer is going to be dumping air out. It doesn't dump air out. And no, it's not because the driver hangs his hoses up behind his cab on those glad hand holders. That's not what stops the air from coming out of it. Okay. The The thing that stops the air from dumping out when we're bobtailing is the tractor protection valve. The tractor protection valve is a valve that closes off the signal if we're not hooked up to a trailer. Okay, how does it do that? Well, we have a trailer supply valve. Okay, our trailer supply valve is going to be sourcing air from the air brake system on the truck. That trailer supply valve is the red knob in the cab. And if I push that in, that's how I send air to the trailer, charge the reservoir on the trailer, and to also release the trailer parking brakes. Okay, because there's going to be a trailer brake valve on the trailer. And that brake valve on the trailer, it kind of does a couple of things, if you think about it. Okay? It acts like a relay valve for the parking brakes on the trailer. Depending on the way it's set up, it can also act as anti-compounding for the trailer. We'll get to that in a second, because we do the same thing on the truck. Okay. And also, it allows air to pass through it to charge the reservoir on the trailer. So that's what happens when I push that trailer supply valve. I'm opening up the truck's air system to the trailer's air system. Okay. Now, did I accidentally get my colors right here? Yeah, because usually if you got a red line and a blue line, your red line is going to be your supply line, your blue line is going to be your service line, or your signal line. We call it a service line, but realistically, it's just a pilot signal telling the brakes on the trailer to turn on, right? So there we go. But one thing that I didn't talk about yet is what happens in the tractor protection valve, okay? There has to be pressure in the supply line to cause a spool to shift over in the tractor protection valve to open up air, or well, not to open up air, to open up the passage so that if there is air pressure in that signal or that service line, to allow it to go through to the trailer. That's what stops you from having air dumping out of that service line every time you hit the brakes when you're bobtailing. Right? And if you want to test and see if that valve works properly, go ahead, leave your red knob popped out, grab your spike in the cab, head out back and see if you can hear air leaking out of your blue glad hand. If air is dumping out your blue glad hand, your tractor protection valve is not working. Let's get some of this stuff out of here. Let's have a little chat about what that yellow knob is for. The cab. Okay, so my yellow knob over here is my parking brake valve, and that's the parking brake valve for the tractor, not for the trailer. Okay, so if you hop in a truck and you just push the yellow one in, you happen to have a trailer hooked up, so you're like, I'm going to release my parking brakes, you hit your yellow one, but you don't touch the red one, you're not going anywhere. Or if you do, you're dragging your bogies on the trailer. Okay, so this yellow knob, what exactly does it do? Well, let's follow it back. It's going to send air through this line over here. And when it's sending that air off to this relay valve, because this is another relay valve, call it whatever you want, but really it's just another relay valve, okay? And if I send air pressure there, again, that's just the pilot signal that opens up the relay to send air to the spring brake chambers. And when I send air to the spring brake chambers, parking brakes on the truck release. Okay. Another thing that I have is this line. Let me get me a different color of pen here. This line right here. Okay. It's called the anti-compound line on this diagram. But this is really the thing that is the anti-compounding feature on the brakes. Now, what does anti-compounding mean, or what does compounding the brakes mean? Does anybody know?
Applying your brakes when your park brake is on.
So if we have parking brakes applied to spring brakes, and then I go ahead and step on the treadle valve, that means that I've got force from the spring and I've got force from the service brake chamber acting on the push rod, the slack adjuster, S-cam, and all the foundation brake components. That's a lot more force than they're normally designed to handle, and you can damage stuff. All right. So what does anti-compounding do? Well, if we think about it, anti-compounding is there to make sure that we don't have basically two sets of brakes applied at the same time, or two things trying to apply the brakes at the same time. So let's go ahead and take away that pressure signal from park brake valve. Okay. So if I hit the brake pedal in the cab, but I don't have the park brakes released, that means there's no pressure in these lines. And when I hit the brake pedal, that means that now I've got air pressure building up in the service side. But what I do is I actually tap right into that signal there, and I use that as the pilot to open up the park brake or the spring brake relay valve. That's all that anti-compounding is. It's very, very simple. If I hit the service brakes, service brake pressure acts as pilot pressure to release the spring brakes. That's all that anti-compounding is. Okay, so basically what happens is, as I apply one, I release the other. Very simple. Get rid of some more of this stuff here. And let's see what else there is to talk about. I could go down a rabbit hole and start talking about this spring brake valve and what it does and exactly how it works, but I want to keep things relatively simple here. The spring brake valve, imagine a scenario where we had a failure in the air brake system. Okay, so we have a failure in the air brake system, and the spring brakes are still released. My service brakes are no longer functioning because I don't have primary pressure anymore. Something has failed in the primary side, right? And that means that when I hit the brake pedal, I'm not going to have the same pilot signal that I normally would have had available to me to apply the service brakes. And even if I tried to, there's no air in the primary reservoir to apply them anyways. So what do I do? Well, here's what I do. I take a valve that I can open and close. And this valve is only going to open and close if there's a failure in the primary system. That's a way to really, really simplify the way it works. But if we say if there's a failure in the primary, the spring brake valve does what it's supposed to do. What does it do? It dumps air out of the spring brake chambers so that the springs now apply the brakes on your drives. And then when you let go of the brake valve, it takes air from the secondary through the spring brake valve and recages the park brakes again. Does that make sense? So just imagine your spring brakes. There's still air pressure in those chambers, and it's still holding them released. And if I was to vent some of that air pressure out, the springs would now start to apply the service brakes, or will start to apply the brakes. Okay. And then if I let go of the brake pedal, I just reapply that air back into the spring brake chamber, and the brakes release again. It's kind of a backup braking system. So to say that if we lose all pressure in the primary, you do not have access to use the service brakes anymore, that's not really a true statement on a modern truck. Because your spring brake valve is still going to let you modulate the air pressure in the spring brake chambers and use those instead of the service brake chambers. Okay. Let's get rid of some of this stuff here and let's talk about some things that can happen. Actually, no, before we do that, we should probably take a quick peek at the front here. So we haven't talked about the secondary system very much. The secondary system, your brake chambers are not going to be a spring brake and service brake combination. It's going to be just service brakes for your front brakes. Okay, those brake chambers, they might be operating drum brakes, they might be operating disc brakes, but it's still just a single thing. It's not a spring chamber as well. Okay, so your front brakes, here we're looking at a system that has ABS modulators. Not all systems had ABS modulators. Some of them just had a limiting valve, okay, which would do exactly what it sounds like. It just limits the amount of pressure that we can send to the front brakes. On a vehicle like a fully loaded semi-truck, it makes a lot of sense to do that. The reason being, think about where the bulk of the weight's going to be on a fully loaded semi. It's going to be on the drives, isn't it? Not on the steer axle. And if we lock up the steer axle, we have no steering. So if I reduce braking force on the front steering axle, that's going to give me the ability to maintain steering control even under heavy braking. So a limiting valve would do that. And a limiting valve, it basically just restricts airflow to the front brake chambers once we're beyond a certain amount of pressure in the system. And then obviously under emergency braking, once we get past another pressure threshold, that limiting valve is going to open up and give us full braking force to the front chambers. Nowadays, we usually don't do that. We rely on the ABS to handle that for us. If the wheels start to lock up, we use the ABS modulators to reduce pressure to the brake chambers, thereby stopping the wheels from skidding. Okay. Your brake treadle valve is actually two valves in one housing. When you push on the brake pedal, you're actually operating the two air brake systems simultaneously. And when you push down on the pedal, you're not actually operating the valve. Did you know that? When you push down on the brake pedal in the cab, the only thing that you're really doing is compressing a spring. It's pretty much all you're doing. Okay. So inside that brake treadle valve there, when you push down on the pedal, you compress a spring. That spring pushes down on the valve. When that valve opens, air pressure is sent as pilot pressure off to our relay valves and wherever else it's supposed to go. That same air pressure is also used to operate the secondary air valve. Okay. And that same air pressure also acts on the bottom of the treadle valve itself to kick back up at you when you're busy pushing down on the spring on the top of it. Why do you think that pedal gets harder to push on the harder you push on it? You think about that. If you ever hop up in a semi and you push down on the brake valve, assuming the air system is charged up, the harder you push on the pedal, the harder it gets to push. For those of you familiar with trucks, if you've driven them enough, you know what I'm talking about, right? If you hop into a truck where the air brake system is completely bled down and there's no air in it, it's a lot easier to push that pedal all the way down, isn't it? And the reason for that is there's no air kicking back up at you from the bottom of the valve. That's what gives you the brake feel when you're hitting that treadle valve. Okay. So I think I've milked this diagram for as much as I possibly can, and we're going to go ahead and skip through a number of these other ones here. And we'll slow down and take a look when I get to some components. At the beginning of the conversation, I was talking a little bit about how the unloading system works and what the governor does. The compressor unloading system, its job is to shut the compressor off. And here we can see just a nice side view of the unloader piston with the air pressure from the governor, pushing it up, holding the intake valves open, stopping the compressor from discharging air. Okay. So do a quick snip here and we'll trace that out. So if your governor is mounted, wherever it happens to be mounted, when the governor is in the unloading state, it's going to send air to a port on the compressor, air pressure. That air pressure is going to shift the unloading piston up, and it's going to hold the intake valve open. And now any air that's coming out of this compressor, instead of it going through the exhaust valve to the reservoir, it's not going to go there anymore. It's going to go back out the intake valve. And now assuming that we have two pistons in this compressor, it's just going to circulate back and forth between the two pistons. Okay. Most compressors are lubricated with oil from the engine's lubrication system. And what that means is oil consumption could be a problem with the compressor, not necessarily just an engine problem, it could be a compressor problem. But if oil consumption because of a compressor issue is happening, we're going to be able to tell pretty easily. Assuming, of course, the driver, the operator is a kind of person that's going to empty their wet tank on a regular basis, pay close attention to their equipment. Because if you see a lot of oil build up in your wet tank every time you pull that spit valve, that's a red flag that you've got a compressor where the piston rings or the cylinder walls are starting to let go. Okay. So if you got oil in your wet tank, that's an indication of compressor failure. If you got oil in your wet tank, you've also got oil in the desiccant and in your dryer, and the bottom of the purge valve on the dryer is going to look like an oil slick. And guaranteed, your desiccant is not doing anything if it's completely saturated with oil. This is a look at what's inside of a governor. Nowadays, we typically don't care what's inside of a governor because we typically don't even take these apart to try and fix them. We sometimes can't even adjust them because sometimes nowadays they're just sealed units. All right. The governor is so cheap that if you think there's a problem with it, it's cheaper to replace it than to actually build the labor to try and fix it. The parts are cheaper. The parts to replace this plus the labor to replace it are cheaper than probably the amount of time it would take to get this thing apart, clean it out, put it back together and adjust it at today's labor rates. These are throwaway items nowadays. Okay. If for some reason you decided you wanted to adjust the cut in and cut out pressures on the governor, you would do that. Let's see if I got, yeah, this would work. There's a nut. Okay. So there's a nut, okay, and that's the same thing over here. And there's a screw, okay, and that's this adjustment screw. So you just back off the lock nut, turn the adjustment screw, and you can change your pressure there. Realistically, what you're doing is you're changing the cutout pressure when you turn that. And there's one point I want to make here. If you get asked anything about it, what direction do you turn the screw to increase the pressure? This works exactly backwards from the relief valve that you're familiar with. Most times with a relief valve, if you want higher pressure, you tighten the screw up. In this case, because of the way this thing is designed, you actually have to back the screw out to increase the cutout pressure. And if you take a look at how it's put together, it kind of makes sense because backing it out would compress the spring instead of turning it in. You follow? Okay. This is a look at the internals of a treadle valve. Okay. Now your treadle valve, like I already said, is really just two valves in one. We could pick this apart with a fine-tooth comb, but we don't really have that much time today. And again, how exactly things work inside of a treadle valve, this isn't something that you're ever going to tear apart either. If you happen to have a treadle valve problem, what are you going to do? You're going to put a new one on. You don't mess around with these things, okay? This is one of those things that's literally life or death if you get it wrong, you know, under the wrong circumstances. You want to be sure that your treadle valve works and works properly. Inside the treadle valve, like I said, we basically have the very top part right here. And that top part is what the pedal is pushing on when you push down with your foot. And what does that do? Well, you can see this thing is loaded with springs. But if you trace, you know, far enough down here, you'll see that it does actually compress a spring and open a valve. Okay. And the harder you push on it, the more tension you're putting, putting on that spring. And the more tension you put on that spring, the more air pressure it's going to take to push back up and close the air supply off again. Because a treadle valve, believe it or not, is really just a pressure reducing valve. That's all it is. Okay. And a pressure reducing valve, if you think about it, whatever the spring tension is on top is basically going to, excuse me, I think I drew that one wrong. No, this is fine. Okay, so whatever the downstream pressure is, that's what's going to determine how much pressure it takes to kick this thing up and shut it off, right? A pressure reducing valve, the amount of pressure that we have downstream is dependent on whatever the spring tension is on the valve itself. And if there's effectively no spring tension on the valve itself, it's not going to take any pressure to shift that thing up and cut off the air supply. Okay, and we also have a little helper spring on the bottom helping to shift it up and shut it off. Helper springs on the bottom. Here's some, here's some, here's some. See what I'm getting at? So this thing's always trying to shut itself off until you start compressing the spring on the top with your pedal. Okay. And the harder you compress the spring on the top, the more air pressure it takes downstream, push that thing back up closed. All right. It's actually kind of ingenious, kind of simple. And here's another thing. And this is just a simple little brain teaser troubleshooting thing. A couple of possible answers for this one. I'll see what you can come up with. Operator comes in, doing a pre-trip, because they were actually doing a pre-trip this morning. And they're like, hey, my brake lights don't shut off on me today. Like, oh, cool. So you go out, you take a look at it, and there's one of two highly likely things that happened here. What do you guys think that might be? Brake lights are staying on.
Spike on the side of the steering wheel.
You got to speak up a little bit there. I barely heard
The
that.
spike on the side of the steering wheel.
So maybe the trailer brake valve or the spike has been left pulled. I've seen that. What's the other possibility? Sometimes you have operators who are not the tidiest people, let's put it that way. Okay. So their cab is an absolute disaster, including the floor. And there is mud built up all over everywhere, including underneath the back of the brake pedal. Okay, might be ice and snow, might be gravel, dirt, sand, what have you. If you know, you know. All right. There's been times where I've had guys complaining their brakes were dragging or the brake lights never shut off. And the first two things I would always check: is your spike pulled? No. Okay. How clean is your cab? I go I'll bring a screwdriver with me and dig out all that crap from underneath the back of the pedal. 9 times out of 10, that was all it took. Because if the back of the pedal is held up, that means the front of the pedal is held down. That's the same thing you do when you're trying to apply the brakes. Okay. Relay valves, we could spend some time talking about this, but basically a relay valve, the way it works is we send air in from whatever our control source is. That's going to act on a piston, and that piston does two things. It closes off an exhaust valve, right? And it opens up a flow path from the supply hose that goes from the reservoir to the relay valve, and it sends it off to the delivery ports, which go off to the brake chambers. So here's another question for you. Let's say that we have a customer complaint. Let's go back and see if I can find one with this valve shut. Yeah, this will work. So we have a customer complaint, and the customer complaint is that we can hear air constantly leaking out of the exhaust port on the relay valve when all the brakes are released. Let's think about that statement for a second. When all the brakes are released, where is their pressure in the brake chambers? Because I have a service and I have a parking brake side, my brake chamber. If all of the brakes are released, is there pressure anywhere? Yes, there is.
Should be on your spring side, shouldn't there?
Right. So if the brakes are released, if all the brakes are released, that means there is pressure in the spring brake side. Okay. There is not pressure in the service brake side. And yet somehow we've got air leaking out of the relay valve. Okay. Now, you might think that it's got to be the relay valve. The relay valve is the thing that's leaking, so the relay valve is the thing we got to replace. You might be right, but you might be wrong. Now, if all the brakes are released, that means that we don't have any pressure here. If all the brakes are released and the service or the service relay, service brake relay is working properly, we should be sealing off any of this primary inside of it. Now, granted, if there was a leak internally in the relay, yes, you might hear it in the exhaust. But chances are, if there was a leak in there, that's hard to say. You'd probably just hear a leak. But if that wasn't the problem, let's say that you change that relay valve and it's still leaking. Okay. And then you change it again because you got a bad part the first time and it's still leaking. Now what? That's not, we can't keep changing parts and having the same result. So obviously that's not the problem. The problem is more than likely an internal leak in the brake chamber, in one of your brake chambers. An internal leak in one of your brake chambers is going to cause air pressure to go from the spring brake side, where it is, to leak internally through into the service brake side, through the delivery port, and out the open exhaust port on the service relay. Okay, how do you find a problem like that? It's quite simple. You'll get your pinch off pliers, start pinching off the service brake lines from your brake chambers one by one. When you get to the right one, the leak is going to stop. Okay. This is a quick release valve. A quick release valve is something that we may find use on, front brakes where we want to vent the air nice and quick. We don't actually use a relay valve a lot of times for the front brakes because they're smaller brake chambers and a lot closer to the treadle valve. So oftentimes the treadle valve is not just being a pilot valve, it is supplying air directly to the front brakes. I push down on the pedal. The inlet port takes air from the pedal, the treadle valve. It closes off the exhaust port. The diaphragm moves down. Air goes off to the delivery ports, front brake supply. I let go of the pedal in the cab. The treadle valve vents the air from the inlet port. And then rather than waiting for all of the air from the brake chambers to go all the way back through the treadle valve, what we do is we just pop open with a spring that diaphragm and open up to an exhaust port and quickly dump the air out. That's all that this is. We've gone over testing the valves. We have a couple of different troubleshooting scenarios here. I would recommend that you take a few minutes and go through the handouts that you can download. This is actually the one right off of Moodle that I'm using right now, and just have a read through these different troubleshooting scenarios for yourself. I don't feel like sitting here and reading this to you. I don't think that's been a beneficial use of our time, but take a few minutes and have a read through some of these different troubleshooting scenarios. Okay. Now, there is one thing that we didn't really talk about, and we're just going to spend a quick minute talking about it, and that's the actual brakes themselves. Okay. And here we're talking about the brake chamber and the push rod and the slack adjuster. The slack adjuster obviously operates our S-cam. And that S-cam is going to push on some rollers, which is going to push our brake shoes apart. And the brake shoes are fastened at the bottom to their respective anchor pins. And that means each brake shoe moves out against the drum. Then we apply the brakes. Simple, right? How is it that we can stop an 80 to 100 plus thousand pound truck with a maximum of 120 PSI of air pressure? It's amazing. Okay. The reason it works is because of this formula right here. And this formula right here. When we're looking at these different formulas, we can kind of work these together. And we can see that with 120 PSI acting on the surface area of the diaphragm in the brake chamber, we're going to develop a fair amount of force on the push rod. If force is equal to pressure times area, and I'm going to pick super simple numbers here. I'm going to say that there was 10 square inches of surface area on that diaphragm. Now let's be realistic. How big a round is a typical 30-30 pot? Right? It's about 6-ish inches. I don't know. The reason they call it a 30-30 is because it's got 30 square inches of surface area, basically. All right. But I want my numbers to be simple, so I'm going to say there's 10 square inches of surface area on this particular brake chamber. If I use my formula, and this is one that you guys learned in level 2 hydraulics, I believe, force is equal to pressure times area, I now have pressure of 120 psi and area of 10 square inches, which is going to give me a force of 1,200 pounds. That means I've got 1,200 pounds of force on that rod. You want to be even more realistic than that? If that actually had been a 30 square inch brake chamber, which they are more closer to that than 10 square inches, that right there, it'd be 3,600 pounds of force on that rod with a full brake application. Isn't that nuts? Okay, but we're keeping our numbers simple. Okay, so let's say that my slack adjuster is like a normal slack adjuster and it's about 6 inches long. Okay, because most of them are right around that 6 inch mark. So if that's 6 inches long, that means that I've basically got 0.5 feet, right? Force times distance in terms of, trying to figure out how much torque or force we're going to end up applying on these S-cam rollers here. So if I got 1,200 pounds and I got a half of a foot there, that is 600 foot-pounds of torque that we're basically applying on that S-cam. Push those brake shoes apart. Okay. So in a really simplified look at how an air brake system works, you can see that we are developing tremendous amounts of force, even with a relatively small amount of pressure, because we're taking advantage of that notion that force is going to be equal to pressure times area in terms of fluid dynamics, and also we're taking advantage of the leverage principle with the slack adjuster. So I think that's about it for this video here. We've gone over the components of the system and how that all works, how the components interact with one another. We've gone over some basic troubleshooting for certain parts of the system. We've talked about how the features and functions of some of the individual components themselves work. And we've also talked about the mechanical, the foundation brake portion of the system as well. Okay, so we are going to wrap it up here.